The billionaire's daughter lived trapped in silence for 7 years, and a poor 7-year-old with no medical training solved what experts couldn't. But what that little girl pulled out changed everything. The marble floors of the Whitmore estate stretched endlessly, reflecting the chandelier light like a frozen ocean, and in the corner of the grand living room, a small girl with mahogany skin knelt beside an even smaller child who sat motionless, staring at nothing, hearing nothing, trapped in a world the rest of them would never understand. Eleanor Whitmore was 7 years old and had never heard her mother's voice, never heard music, never heard the sound of rain against the towering windows of her family's Fifth Avenue penthouse, and the doctors had tried everything, every surgery, every implant, every experimental procedure that money could buy. But the silence remained, thick and impenetrable as a wall. The girl kneeling beside her was named Grace, and she was the daughter of the woman who cleaned the Whitmore bathrooms every Tuesday and Thursday, a woman so quiet that most of the family forgot she existed until they needed something. And Grace had come to work with her mother that day because school was closed and there was no one else to watch her. Grace wore clothes that had been worn by someone else first, hand-me-downs with faded colors and loose threads, and her shoes were too small, pinching her toes. But she never complained because complaining was a luxury her mother had taught her they couldn't afford. Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor's mother, swept through the room like a cold wind, her heels clicking against the marble with sharp, impatient sounds, and she barely glanced at Grace as she spoke to the housekeeper. "I don't want her touching anything," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never having to consider the feelings of people she considered beneath her. "Keep her in the kitchen or take her home. I can't have random children running around when we have guests coming." Grace's mother nodded quickly, her eyes down, her hands wringing the cleaning cloth she always carried. "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry, ma'am. She'll be quiet. You won't even know she's here." But Eleanor had noticed Grace, had turned her head toward the girl with curious, intelligent eyes that seemed too old for her small face, and she reached out one pale hand toward Grace, a gesture so simple and human that it cut through all the wealth and privilege that surrounded her. Grace smiled, a warm, genuine smile that transformed her face, and she took Eleanor's hand gently, and for a moment, something passed between them, some understanding that existed beyond words, beyond sound, beyond all the barriers that the world had built between them. The household staff moved around them like ghosts, people who cleaned and cooked and maintained the perfection of the Whitmore world but were never truly seen, never truly acknowledged as fully human, and Grace watched them with eyes that absorbed everything, the way the butler's shoulders tensed when Mr. Whitmore barked orders, the way the cook's hands trembled slightly when Mrs. Whitmore complained about the temperature of her coffee, the way her own mother became smaller somehow, as if she could fold herself into invisibility. Over the following weeks, Grace returned with her mother, always quiet, always careful not to disturb anything, and she found herself drawn to Eleanor, sitting beside her while the deaf girl played with expensive toys that seemed to bring her no joy. The other members of the household barely noticed their friendship developing. These two girls from opposite ends of the world, one surrounded by everything money could buy but trapped in silence, the other poor but alert to every sound, every whisper, every breath. Grace began to notice things about Eleanor that no one else seemed to see, the way the girl would sometimes wince and touch her left ear, the way she would tilt her head at odd angles as if trying to find a position that brought relief, the way her fingers would probe gently at the side of her head when she thought no one was watching. The Whitmore family hosted a charity gala one evening, the kind of event where wealthy people gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity while spending more on champagne than they donated to the cause, and Grace's mother was called in to help with the extra work, and Grace came too, dressed in her cleanest clothes, which still looked shabby against the backdrop of silk gowns and tailored suits. Mr. Whitmore, Eleanor's father, stood in the center of the ballroom, his voice booming as he spoke about his daughter's condition, using her silence as a prop for his own image, talking about how much money he'd spent on treatments, how he'd flown in specialists from Switzerland and Japan, how he'd done everything humanly possible. "Some things," he said with practiced sadness, "are simply beyond even the reach of modern medicine. But we never give up hope." The guests murmured sympathetically, their faces arranged in expressions of concern that would vanish the moment they moved on to the next conversation, and Eleanor sat beside her mother on a raised platform, displayed like a beautiful, broken doll, and Grace watched from the shadows near the kitchen door where the help was allowed to stand. A woman in a diamond necklace leaned toward her companion and said, just loud enough for Grace to hear, "It's such a shame. At least she's pretty." She'll still be able to marry well, even if she can't hear. Another guest nodded toward Grace's mother, who was refilling water glasses. I don't know why Catherine lets the help bring their children. It's inappropriate. The word stung, not because Grace wasn't used to being looked down upon, but because she was 7 years old and still believed that people should be judged by their hearts, not their bank accounts, and the casual dismissal of her existence, as if she were less human because her mother cleaned toilets, planted something dark and knowing in her young mind. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the staff was cleaning up the remains of the party, Grace found Eleanor alone in her bedroom, sitting on the edge of a bed that cost more than Grace's family made in a year. Eleanor was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, and Grace approached slowly, carefully, and sat beside her. Eleanor looked at her, and Grace could see the frustration in those eyes, the rage of a child who had never heard her own voice, who lived in a world that moved and spoke around her but never included her. And Grace took Eleanor's hand and squeezed it gently. They sat together in silence, one girl who couldn't hear and one girl who heard too much. And in that moment, Grace made a promise to herself that she would help Eleanor somehow, even though she had no idea how a poor 7-year-old could do what teams of expensive doctors had failed to do. The next Thursday, Grace came again, and she brought a small flashlight she'd found in her mother's cleaning supplies. And when no one was watching, she asked Eleanor to tilt her head, and Eleanor understood somehow, perhaps reading something in Grace's expression, and she tilted her head, and Grace shined the flashlight carefully into Eleanor's ear. What she saw made her breath catch, a small glint of something that didn't belong, something foreign and wrong pushed deep into the ear canal, and Grace's heart began to pound because she knew she'd found something, but she was just a child, and who would believe her, and what if she was wrong, and what if she made things worse? She tried to tell her mother, pulling on her sleeve while her mother was scrubbing the kitchen floor, whispering urgently about what she'd seen, but her mother shook her head firmly. Grace, baby, you can't go around making up stories about these people. They have the best doctors in the world. You think you know something they don't? You'll get me fired, and then where will we be? Grace wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she'd really seen something, but she saw the fear in her mother's eyes, the terror of losing the job that kept them fed and housed, and she fell silent. Days passed, then weeks, and Grace couldn't stop thinking about what she'd seen, that small glint of something that shouldn't be there, and she began to watch Eleanor more carefully, and she noticed other things, the way Eleanor's grandmother, who lived in the guest wing of the estate, would sometimes look at the child with an expression Grace couldn't quite read, something between satisfaction and guilt. The grandmother, old Mrs. Whitmore, was a stern woman who ruled the family with an iron will despite her age, and she had opinions about everything, especially about Eleanor. Grace overheard her one day, speaking to Eleanor's mother in the hallway outside the library. The child is damaged, the grandmother said coldly. You should have had another one by now. What's the point of keeping her front and center like this? She's an embarrassment at social functions. Mrs. Whitmore's voice was defensive but weak. Mother, she's my daughter. The doctors say there's still hope. The doctors say what you pay them to say, the grandmother interrupted. Face reality, Catherine. She'll never be normal. She'll never take over the company. James needs a proper heir. Grace, hidden behind a potted plant, felt anger rise in her chest like fire, anger at the casual cruelty, at the way these people talked about Eleanor as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved, and she thought about her own mother, who had so little but loved Grace with a fierceness that needed no words. The following Tuesday, Grace came prepared. She'd been thinking and planning, and she'd asked her school nurse about ear problems, pretending she was asking for a friend, and the nurse had told her about foreign objects that could get lodged in ear canals, about how children sometimes push things into their ears, beads or small toys, and how sometimes those objects could cause complete hearing loss if they were left there long enough, pressing against the eardrum, causing damage and inflammation. Grace had brought a pair of tweezers from home, clean and small, and she'd practiced on a doll, trying to imagine how steady her hands would need to be. And she was terrified but determined because someone had to help Eleanor, and if the adults wouldn't listen to a poor black girl who cleaned houses with her mother, then she would have to help Eleanor herself. She found Eleanor in the playroom, alone as usual, and Grace closed the door gently behind her. She knelt beside Eleanor and pointed to her own ear, then to Eleanor's ear, and Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding that Grace wanted to look again, and Grace shined her flashlight into Eleanor's ear, And there it was, that glint of something metallic, and Grace's hands began to shake because this was real. This was not her imagination, something was actually there. Grace pointed to the tweezers and mimed pulling something out, and Eleanor's eyes widened, and for a moment Grace thought she would refuse, thought she would run away or call for help, but instead Eleanor nodded, a small, decisive movement, and tilted her head, giving Grace access to her ear. Grace's hands steadied as she focused, the tweezers trembling slightly as she brought them closer to Eleanor's ear canal, and she could see it now more clearly. A small piece of something metallic, wedged deep, and she knew she had to be incredibly careful because one wrong move could push it deeper or hurt Eleanor's eardrum. She worked slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the tweezers moving into the narrow space, and Eleanor stayed perfectly still, trusting this poor girl she barely knew with something the doctors had somehow missed, and Grace could feel sweat on her forehead, could feel her heart hammering in her chest, and then the tweezers made contact with the object, and she gripped it gently, and began to pull. The object resisted at first, embedded in the inflamed tissue, and Grace applied steady, careful pressure, and Eleanor whimpered slightly, a small sound of discomfort, and then suddenly the object came free, sliding out of the ear canal, and Grace held it up to the light, and they both stared at it. It was a small metal bead, decorative and expensive looking, the kind that might come from a piece of jewelry, and it was covered in dried blood and tissue, and Grace knew with absolute certainty that this object had been in Eleanor's ear for years, blocking her hearing, causing all the problems that doctors had attributed to nerve damage or developmental issues. Eleanor blinked, her eyes unfocused, and then suddenly her expression changed, transforming from confusion to shock to overwhelming emotion, and she gasped, a sound that came from deep in her chest, and she turned her head this way and that, and Grace realized with a jolt of pure joy that Eleanor could hear. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Grace with an expression of wonder and terror and gratitude all mixed together, and she opened her mouth and made sounds, not words yet but sounds, trying out her voice for the first time in years, and Grace started crying too, and the two girls hugged each other, rocking back and forth, and in that moment, all the barriers of class and race and circumstance meant nothing. They were just two children, and one had saved the other. But then the door opened and Mrs. Whitmore stood there, her face pale with shock, and behind her was the grandmother, old Mrs. Whitmore, and the grandmother's expression went from surprise to something darker, something that made Grace's stomach drop. "What have you done?" Mrs. Whitmore screamed, rushing forward and pulling Eleanor away from Grace. "What have you done to my daughter?" Grace held up the bead, her hand shaking. "I found this in her ear. It was blocking her hearing. She can hear now. She's okay." But Mrs. Whitmore wasn't listening, was examining Eleanor frantically, and the grandmother stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the bead in Grace's hand, and Grace saw it then, saw the flash of recognition, saw the fear, and she understood something terrible, something that made her feel cold all over. The grandmother had known about the bead. The grandmother had put it there. Mrs. Whitmore was calling for Mr. Whitmore, her voice hysterical, and within minutes the room was filled with people, the butler and the cook and Grace's mother, and Mr. Whitmore was there, demanding to know what happened, and Mrs. Whitmore was crying and holding Eleanor, and the grandmother stood in the corner silent and watchful. Grace's mother pulled Grace aside, her face terrified. "What did you do? Baby, what did you do?" Grace tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other, about the bead and the flashlight and how Eleanor could hear now, but her mother's face only grew more frightened, because she knew what Grace was too young to fully understand, that poor black girls didn't go around fixing what teams of rich white doctors couldn't fix, that the world would find a way to punish them for this, even if it was the right thing to do. Mr. Whitmore held the bead up to the light, examining it, and his face was unreadable. "Where did this come from?" he demanded, looking at Grace. "It was in Eleanor's ear," Grace said, her voice small but steady. "It was blocking her hearing. That's why she couldn't hear. I pulled it out and now she can hear." The room went silent and everyone turned to look at Eleanor, who was clinging to her mother but whose eyes were wide and alert, tracking the sounds around her, clearly hearing for the first time in years. "She's lying," the grandmother said suddenly, her voice sharp and commanding. "This is absurd. The child has been examined by the finest specialists in the world. Are we to believe that this uneducated cleaning woman's daughter somehow found something they all missed? She probably put it there herself to get attention or money from us." Grace felt the words like a physical blow, and she saw her mother's face crumble, saw the other servants step back slightly, distancing themselves from the accusation, and she understood in that moment how easy it would be for the grandmother to destroy them, how little their truth mattered against her power. But then Eleanor spoke, her voice rusty and uncertain but clear. "She helped me," Eleanor said, the words slightly slurred but unmistakable. "Grace helped me. She pulled it out. I can hear." The room erupted in chaos, Mr. Whitmore shouting for the family doctor, Mrs. Whitmore crying and laughing simultaneously, the servants murmuring amongst themselves, and in the middle of it all, the grandmother stood frozen, her face a mask of barely controlled rage, and Grace saw her look at the bead, and Grace saw her understand that everything was about to unravel. The doctor arrived within the hour, a distinguished man with gray hair who had been the Whitmore family physician for decades, and he examined Eleanor thoroughly, shining lights in her ears, testing her hearing with various sounds, and his face grew more and more perplexed. "This is extraordinary," he said finally. "Her hearing appears to be returning to normal function. The inflammation in the ear canal suggests a foreign object was present for an extended period, possibly years. The removal has allowed the pressure on the eardrum to release." Mr. Whitmore's voice was dangerous and quiet. "How is it possible that you and every other specialist we consulted missed this?" The doctor's face reddened. "Sir, foreign objects are typically easily visible with an otoscope. I don't understand how this could have been missed. Unless..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Unless what?" Mr. Whitmore demanded. "Unless it was placed there deliberately, in such a way and at such a time that it became embedded and harder to detect as the ear canal swelled and adapted around it," the doctor said slowly. "If this object was inserted when she was an infant, before her first examinations, it might have been mistaken for a structural abnormality or simply missed in the general inflammation." The room went very still, and everyone turned to look at the grandmother, who stood with her chin raised, defiant. "This is preposterous," she said coldly. "Are you accusing me of something?" Mr. Whitmore's face had gone white. "Mother, what have you done?" The grandmother's facade cracked slightly. "I did what needed to be done. You were so obsessed with this child, with making her the heir, with building everything around her. You couldn't see what was obvious to everyone else. She was weak, damaged goods. I gave you time to have another child, a proper heir, someone who could actually run the company. But Catherine kept insisting we wait, kept pouring money into useless treatments, kept making that deaf child the center of everything." Mrs. Whitmore made a sound like a wounded animal. "You did this to your own granddaughter?" The grandmother's eyes were cold. "I did this for the family, for the company, for the legacy your father built. That child was going to destroy everything, being paraded around like some tragic figure, making us look weak. I gave you 7 years to move on and do what needed to be done." The butler moved quietly to stand between the grandmother and the door, and Grace realized that Mr. Whitmore must have signaled him somehow, must have understood that his mother was confessing to something terrible and needed to be prevented from leaving. Mr. Whitmore's voice shook with rage. "You tortured my daughter for 7 years. You made her live in silence. You made us believe she was broken. You made me grieve for the child I thought I'd lost." The grandmother lifted her chin higher. "I did what you didn't have the strength to do. And you're all acting like I committed some crime. In some cultures, defective children aren't even allowed to survive. I gave her life. I just tried to steer it in a direction that wouldn't destroy everything." Grace's mother had pulled Grace into a corner, trying to make them both invisible, but Grace couldn't stop watching, couldn't tear her eyes away from the terrible scene unfolding before her, and she felt Eleanor's small hand slip into hers, and she held on tight. The police came, and then lawyers, and then reporters who somehow got wind of the story and gathered outside the gates of the estate like hungry wolves, and Grace and her mother were caught in the middle of it all, their quiet existence shattered. They were taken to the police station, not as suspects but as witnesses, and Grace told her story over and over again, about the flashlight and the bead and Eleanor's first sounds, and her mother sat beside her, crying quietly, knowing that their life was about to change in ways they couldn't control. The grandmother was arrested, charged with child abuse and assault, and the story exploded across the media, the headline appearing in newspapers and on television screens across the country. Billionaire's mother deliberately deafened granddaughter for 7 years. The Whitmore family became the subject of intense scrutiny. their wealth and privilege no longer a shield but a spotlight that illuminated every crack in their perfect facade. And people across the country debated the case, argued about class and family, and what wealth did to people's morals. But in the middle of all the chaos, something else happened, something smaller but more important. Mr. Whitmore called Grace and her mother to his office, a room filled with dark wood and leather chairs that smelled like old money, and Grace's mother was terrified, certain they were about to be blamed somehow, certain this was where they would be punished for daring to exist in the same space as these people. But instead, Mr. Whitmore knelt down in front of Grace, his eyes wet with tears, and he took her small dark hands in his large, pale ones and he said, "You saved my daughter. You saw what no one else saw. You were brave enough to act when everyone else, including me, had given up. How can I ever thank you?" Grace didn't know what to say, didn't have words for the complicated emotions swirling inside her, the relief and fear and pride and confusion all mixed together, so she just squeezed his hands and said, "Eleanor is my friend." Mr. Whitmore stood and turned to Grace's mother. "I owe you both more than I can ever repay. Your daughter has given me back mine. I want to set up a trust fund for Grace's education, enough to cover everything from now through college, graduate school if she wants it. I want to hire you as Eleanor's full-time caregiver, with a salary that reflects the value of what you do, not what I can get away with paying. And I want to make sure you never have to worry about housing or security again." Grace's mother started crying harder, shaking her head. "Sir, that's too much. We don't need. You need to let me do this," Mr. Whitmore interrupted gently. "Not because I'm trying to buy your silence or assuage my guilt, but because it's right. Your daughter did what was right, even when it was hard, even when she knew she might get in trouble. She's 7 years old and she has more courage and integrity than most adults I know. Let me support that. Let me help her become whoever she's meant to be." The trust fund was set up, the papers were signed, and Grace's mother became Eleanor's official caregiver, and they moved into a small but comfortable apartment that Mr. Whitmore owned, a place with heat that worked and windows that didn't leak, and Grace had her own room for the first time in her life. The trial was long and brutal, with the grandmother's lawyers trying every strategy to avoid conviction, arguing that she was elderly and confused, that the evidence was circumstantial, that a 7-year-old's testimony was unreliable, but the medical evidence was overwhelming, and the bead was analyzed and matched to a bracelet the grandmother had owned, and in the end, she was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The media circus continued for months, with Grace and her mother at the center of a storm they'd never asked to be part of. Reporters camped outside their building, people stopping them on the street, some to praise Grace's courage, others to accuse her of being part of some conspiracy or money-grabbing scheme. Because there were always people who couldn't accept that a poor black child might have succeeded where wealthy white doctors had failed. Through it all, Grace and Eleanor remained friends, their bond forged in that moment when Grace had held the tweezers steady and Eleanor had trusted her with everything. And Eleanor's hearing improved day by day, and she began speech therapy to learn how to use the voice she'd never heard before. And Grace was there for every milestone, every breakthrough, every frustration. One evening, several months after the bead had been removed, Grace sat with Eleanor in the apartment that Mr. Whitmore had provided, and Eleanor looked at her with serious, thoughtful eyes and said, "Do you know what the worst part was? Not the silence. I got used to the silence. The worst part was everyone looking at me like I was broken, like I was less. Even my own family treated me like I was a problem to be managed instead of a person to be loved." Grace nodded, understanding in a way that most people wouldn't because she'd spent her whole life being looked at like she was less, like she was invisible, like she didn't matter because her mother cleaned houses and her skin was dark and her clothes were secondhand. "But you're not broken," Grace said fiercely. "You never were. The world was broken. The people around you were broken. But not you." Eleanor smiled, and it was a real smile full of warmth and life, and she reached out and hugged Grace, and Grace hugged her back. And they stayed like that for a long moment, two girls who had saved each other in different ways. Mr. Whitmore changed after the revelation about his mother, the guilt and shame weighing on him visibly, aging him years in a matter of months, and he threw himself into making amends, not just to Eleanor but to the world, establishing foundations for children with disabilities, funding medical research, speaking publicly about his failures as a father and as a person. Mrs. Whitmore divorced him quietly, unable to forgive him for not protecting their daughter, for being so focused on his business empire that he'd missed what was happening in his own home, and she moved away with Eleanor, starting fresh in a smaller city where the media attention was less intense, and Grace and her mother went with them, because Eleanor needed Grace and Grace needed Eleanor, and their mothers had formed their own bond, united by the love of their daughters. Years passed and the media attention faded, the way it always does, moving on to the next scandal, the next tragedy, the next compelling story, and Grace and Eleanor grew up together, attending the same schools, sharing secrets and dreams, navigating the complicated world of adolescence side by side. Grace excelled in school, her sharp mind finally given the resources and opportunities it deserved, and she discovered a passion for medicine, for helping people the way she'd helped Eleanor, and Eleanor encouraged her every step of the way, becoming Grace's biggest cheerleader. Eleanor struggled more, dealing with the psychological trauma of what her grandmother had done, the betrayal by someone who should have protected her, the years stolen from her, and she went to therapy regularly, working through her anger and pain, and Grace was always there, a steady presence, never judging, never pushing, just being there. When they were teenagers, a documentary filmmaker approached them wanting to tell their story, to explore themes of class and race and family and resilience, and at first they refused, wanting to move on with their lives, wanting to be more than the tragedy that had defined their childhoods, but eventually they agreed with conditions. They insisted the documentary focus not just on what happened but on the systemic issues that allowed it to happen, on the way poor people are dismissed and ignored, on the way wealth can become a weapon, on the way children are sometimes treated as possessions rather than people, on the way racism makes people assume incompetence even in the face of obvious capability. The documentary premiered at a major film festival and won several awards, and Grace and Eleanor, now 17 years old, stood on stage together at the premiere, Grace in a simple but elegant dress that didn't hide who she was or where she came from, Eleanor beside her in a similar dress, their hands clasped, and they spoke about their experience with the kind of wisdom that comes from surviving something terrible, and choosing to grow from it, rather than be destroyed by it. "People ask me all the time if I've forgiven my grandmother," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear. "And the honest answer is that I'm still working on it. I understand that she was shaped by a world that values profit over people, appearances over authenticity, and legacy over love. I understand that she truly believed she was doing what was best for the family. But understanding isn't the same as excusing. And I can acknowledge her humanity, while still holding her accountable for the harm she caused." Grace spoke next, her voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that had always been there but was now more visible, more confident. "I think about that day a lot, the day I decided to try to help Eleanor even though everyone had told me to stay quiet, to stay in my lane, to accept that I couldn't possibly know something that doctors didn't know. And I think about all the times I'd been told, directly or indirectly, that my voice didn't matter, that my observations weren't valuable, that my presence was at best tolerated and at worst an inconvenience. And I think about how close I came to listening to those voices, to staying quiet, to letting fear and doubt stop me from doing what I knew was right." The audience was silent, hanging on every word, and Grace continued. "The lesson I took from that experience isn't just about trusting yourself or being brave, though those things are important. The lesson is about seeing people, really seeing them. Eleanor's own family looked at her every day and didn't see her pain. Dozens of doctors examined her and didn't see what was wrong. But I saw her because I knew what it was like to be invisible, to be dismissed, to be treated like you don't matter. And sometimes the people society values least are the ones who see the most clearly, because we have to pay attention to survive." The applause was thunderous and Grace and Eleanor stood together, two young women who had started as a billionaire's daughter and a cleaning woman's child, and who had become something more complex and beautiful than those simple labels could capture. They went to college together, Eleanor studying psychology and social work, wanting to help other children who had been failed by the systems meant to protect them, and Grace studying medicine, driven by that same impulse to heal, to help, to see what others missed. They graduated with honors, their mother sitting in the front row at the ceremony, crying tears of joy and pride, and Mr. Whitmore was there too, older now and humbler, having spent the years since the revelation trying to become the father Eleanor deserved, trying to make amends for his failures. Grace went on to medical school, specializing in pediatric otolaryngology, drawn to the field that had been so central to her and Eleanor's story, and she became known for her careful attention to detail, for her willingness to listen to parents and children who insisted something was wrong even when tests said otherwise, for her refusal to dismiss concerns just because they came from people without medical degrees or wealth or power. Eleanor established a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting children from abuse within their own families, working to create better systems for detecting and preventing harm, to train mandated reporters to recognize subtle signs of mistreatment, to provide resources for children who needed help but didn't know how to ask for it. They stayed in touch, their friendship deepening into something that felt more like family than friendship, two souls bound together by trauma and healing. By the moment when a 7-year-old girl had held a pair of tweezers steady and changed the course of 2 lives. The grandmother died in prison, 8 years into her sentence, and Eleanor went to the funeral, not to forgive but to bear witness, to mark the end of that chapter, and Grace went with her, as she always did, standing beside her friend in the cold rain as the casket was lowered into the ground. "Do you regret it?" Eleanor asked quietly as they walked away from the grave. "Helping me that day? Your life would have been so much simpler if you just stayed quiet." Grace stopped and turned to look at her friend, this woman who had been through so much and emerged strong and purposeful, and she shook her head. "I regret nothing. Every hard thing, every scary thing, every moment of doubt, it was all worth it because it led to this. To you being whole. To both of us being free." They walked on in comfortable silence, and Grace thought about the 7-year-old version of herself, kneeling beside a deaf girl with a flashlight and a pair of tweezers, terrified but determined, and she thought about how that moment had defined everything that came after, how one act of courage, of seeing and being seen, had rippled out in ways she could never have imagined. Years later, Dr. Grace Morrison stood in front of a medical conference, giving a keynote address about the importance of listening to patients and their families, about the dangers of diagnostic arrogance, about the way systemic biases can blind even well-meaning professionals to obvious truths. She told Eleanor's story with permission, using it as a case study in what can go wrong when we stop seeing people as people and start seeing them as problems or statistics or inconveniences. "A 7-year-old saw what teams of specialists missed," she said, her voice clear and strong. Not because she was smarter or more educated, but because she was paying attention in a different way. She was seeing Eleanor as a person, not as a patient. She was noticing patterns and changes that others dismissed. She was willing to trust her own observations even when they contradicted expert opinion. And she was brave enough to act on what she knew, even when she knew she might face consequences for it. The audience of doctors and medical students listened intently, some nodding, some looking uncomfortable, some taking notes. "We talk a lot in medicine about evidence-based practice and scientific rigor, and those things are absolutely essential," Grace continued. "But we also need to remember that some of the most important diagnostic information comes from careful observation, from listening to the patient's story, from being willing to look at common things in uncommon ways. And we need to be honest about how our own biases, about race, about class, about who we consider credible or intelligent or worth listening to, can interfere with our ability to see what's right in front of us." She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I'm a doctor today because a little girl was allowed to trust herself, because her courage was eventually recognized and supported. But how many other children out there have insights or observations that could help someone, that could solve a problem, and are being dismissed because of their age or their race or their economic status? How many diagnoses are being missed because we're not willing to listen to the people who know the patient best, even if those people don't have medical degrees?" The question hung in the air, and Grace let it sit there, uncomfortable and challenging, before she moved on to discuss specific protocols and strategies for reducing diagnostic error and improving patient outcomes. After the talk, a young medical student approached her, a black woman with intelligent eyes and nervous hands. "Dr. Morrison, I just wanted to thank you for that talk. I'm first-generation college, and sometimes I feel like I don't belong here, like everyone else has some kind of knowledge or confidence that I'm missing. But your story reminded me that my perspective, my background, the things I've seen and experienced, they're not deficits. They're assets." Grace smiled and took the young woman's hand. "Never let anyone make you feel like you belong anywhere less than you do. Your voice matters. Your observations matter. The world needs doctors who can see people the way you can see them. Don't lose that." Eleanor had her own moments of impact, her nonprofit growing from a small local organization to a national presence, influencing policy and training thousands of social workers and teachers and medical professionals in recognizing signs of familial abuse, and she spoke frequently at conferences and legislative hearings, using her own story as a powerful example of how abuse can hide in plain sight, even in wealthy families, even in homes that look perfect from the outside. One day, nearly 20 years after that pivotal moment when Grace had pulled the bead from her ear, Eleanor received a letter from a woman in California, a mother whose daughter had been experiencing mysterious hearing problems, and the doctors had diagnosed it as nerve damage, irreversible and progressive, and the mother had seen Eleanor's story and just wondered, if perhaps someone should look more carefully at her daughter's ears. Eleanor immediately called Grace, who flew to California and examined the child, and found, lodged deep in the ear canal, a small piece of a toy that had been there for so long that the tissue had grown around it, and Grace removed it carefully, expertly, and the child's hearing began to return, and another family was saved from years of unnecessary suffering. They had saved each other, Grace and Eleanor, that much was clear, but they had also saved countless others, the ripples of that one moment of courage and compassion spreading outward in ways that could never be fully measured, and every child who was seen when they might have been dismissed, every voice that was heard when it might have been silenced, every injustice that was prevented when it might have been perpetrated, all of it connected back to a 7-year-old girl with a flashlight and a pair of tweezers kneeling beside a deaf child in a billionaire's mansion, brave enough to trust what she saw. Grace's mother eventually retired from cleaning houses, though she never lost the work ethic and humility that had defined her life, and she spent her retirement volunteering at the nonprofit Eleanor had founded, answering phones and organizing files and greeting children who came in scared and hurt, and she was exactly the right person for that role, someone who had lived through hardship but maintained her humanity, someone who could look at a frightened child and make them feel seen and safe. Mrs. Whitmore, Eleanor's mother, had remarried eventually, to a quiet, kind man who worked as a teacher and who loved Eleanor without reservation or agenda. And she had finally found the peace that had eluded her in her first marriage, the peace that comes from prioritizing love over appearances, connection over status. Mr. Whitmore never remarried, dedicating himself to his philanthropic work and to rebuilding his relationship with his daughter, and over the years Eleanor forgave him, not because what he'd done was excusable but because she chose to believe in people's capacity to change, to grow, to become better than they were, and he spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that forgiveness. The story of the billionaire's daughter and the cleaning woman's child became one of those stories that people told when they wanted to illustrate something about courage or class or the way the world underestimates people, and sometimes the story got simplified or distorted, the details changed to fit whatever point the storyteller wanted to make, but the core of it remained true. A child had been suffering, and another child had saved her, and the world had tried to dismiss that truth, and the truth had won anyway. Grace and Eleanor remained close as the decades passed, their children growing up together the way they had, the barriers of race and class that might have separated them in another context made irrelevant by the bond they shared. And they grew old together, two women who had started in such different places but had walked parallel paths toward the same destination. A life dedicated to seeing people, really seeing them, and refusing to let anyone be invisible. On Grace's 60th birthday, Eleanor threw her a party, nothing fancy but filled with the people who mattered, former patients and their families, colleagues from the hospital, volunteers from Eleanor's nonprofit, Grace's children and grandchildren, and Grace's mother, now in her 80s but still sharp and strong, still the same woman who had cleaned houses with quiet dignity all those years ago. Eleanor stood to give a toast, and the room fell silent, and she looked at Grace with the same gratitude and love that had been in her eyes when she was 7 years old and had heard sound for the first time. "There's a question people ask me sometimes," Eleanor said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "They ask if I ever think about what my life would have been like if Grace hadn't helped me that day. If I'd stayed deaf. If the truth had never come out. And I tell them yes, I think about it all the time. I think about how I would have grown up believing I was broken. How I would have internalized my family's disappointment and disgust. How I would have lived my whole life in silence, never hearing music or laughter or the voices of people I love." She paused, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But then I think about Grace, about what her life would have been like if she'd stayed quiet that day, if she'd listened to the voices telling her she didn't matter, that her observations weren't valuable, that she should know her place. And I realized that she saved both of us. She saved me from silence, yes, but she also saved herself from invisibility. She saved both of us from lives that were smaller than we deserved." Grace was crying now, and Eleanor crossed the room to stand beside her, taking her hand the way Grace had taken hers all those years ago. "The world tells us stories about who matters and who doesn't," Eleanor continued. "About whose voice should be heard and whose should be ignored. About who has value and who's disposable. And sometimes those stories are so pervasive, so powerful, that even good people believe them without questioning. But Grace taught me that truth doesn't care about those stories. Truth is truth regardless of who sees it or who speaks it. And courage is courage whether it comes from a billionaire or a 7-year-old child whose mother cleans houses." The room erupted in applause and people stood and Grace stood too, and she and Eleanor embraced, and Grace whispered in Eleanor's ear, "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for being my friend." And Eleanor whispered back, "Thank you for being brave. Thank you for refusing to be invisible. Thank you for saving me in every way a person can be saved." They pulled apart, both crying and laughing, and the party continued around them. But for a moment they were both back in that bedroom, two 7-year-olds, one holding tweezers and one tilting her head in trust, and the moment when everything changed, when the impossible became possible, when a poor black girl pulled something unbelievable from a billionaire's daughter's ear and changed both their lives forever. In the end, it wasn't money that exposed the truth, wasn't power or privilege or access to the best doctors in the world. It was attention. Care. The willingness of one small girl to see another small girl's pain and refuse to look away. It was the kind of love that exists beyond categories, beyond the barriers society builds to keep certain people separate from others. It was human connection in its purest form, and it had been enough to overcome years of deception, to challenge decades of assumption, to rewrite the story of 2 lives and countless others. The bead that Grace had pulled from Eleanor's ear was eventually donated to a medical museum, mounted in a case with a plaque that told the abbreviated version of their story, and medical students from around the country came to see it, to stand before this small object that had caused so much suffering and to reflect on their own capacity for hubris, for oversight, for missing what was right in front of them. And every year on the anniversary of the day Grace had saved her, Eleanor would call, and they would talk for hours, remembering and laughing and sometimes crying, and they would marvel at how that one moment of courage had created ripples that extended far beyond anything they could have imagined when they were children. Grace would tell Eleanor about the patients she'd helped that year, the diagnoses she'd made that others had missed, the children who could hear because she'd been willing to look more carefully, to listen more deeply, to trust her observations even when they contradicted conventional wisdom. And Eleanor would tell Grace about the children her nonprofit had saved, the policies they'd changed, the awareness they'd raised, the way the world was slowly, incrementally becoming a place where children's pain was taken more seriously, where abuse couldn't hide quite as easily behind wealth and respectability. They would talk about their own children and grandchildren, about the ways they were trying to pass on the lessons they'd learned, about how they were teaching the next generation to see people, really see them, to value every voice, to recognize that wisdom and insight can come from unexpected places, from people the world might dismiss or ignore. And at the end of every conversation, one of them would say, "Can you believe we've been friends for so long?" And the other would laugh and say, "I can't imagine my life without you." And they would both know that it was true, that their friendship was the foundation on which everything else had been built, and that it would last as long as they did. Sometimes people would ask Grace if she ever regretted that day, if she wished she'd lived a quieter life, a simpler life, one not defined by that dramatic moment and everything that came after. And Grace would always shake her head and smile. "That day made me who I am," she would say. "It taught me that I could trust myself, that my voice mattered, that I had the power to change things even when I felt powerless. It taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy or safe, but it's always worth it. And it gave me Eleanor, gave me a friendship that has sustained me through every hard moment since. How could I regret any of that?" And when people asked Eleanor if she'd forgiven her grandmother, if she'd made peace with what happened to her, she would pause before answering, choosing her words carefully. "I've made peace with what happened," she would say. "I've accepted that it shaped me, that I can't change the past, that I have to live with the scars it left. But forgiveness is more complicated than that. I understand my grandmother better now than I did when I was young. I understand the pressures she faced, the world she lived in, the beliefs she held about value and worth and legacy. I understand that she was shaped by forces beyond her control, just as we all are. But understanding isn't the same as excusing, and I can hold space for her humanity while still acknowledging the harm she caused." So yes, I've forgiven her in the sense that I no longer carry active hatred or anger toward her. But I'll never forget what she did, and I'll never stop working to make sure it doesn't happen to other children. The story continued to evolve and spread, taking on new meanings for different generations, and young people who heard it saw it as a story about trusting yourself and challenging authority, about how the system can fail and how individuals have the power to make things right. Older people saw it as a story about the corruption of wealth, about how privilege can blind people to truth, about the importance of humility and humanity. Parents saw it as a story about protecting children, about paying attention, about how the people closest to us can sometimes be the greatest threat. Medical professionals saw it as a cautionary tale about diagnostic hubris, about the importance of thorough examination, about staying humble in the face of what we don't know. Social activists saw it as a story about race and class, about how Black voices are dismissed and how poverty is equated with ignorance, about systemic injustice and the importance of challenging those systems. And children, when they heard the story, saw it as what it had always been. A story about friendship, about one girl helping another, about being brave when you're scared, about doing what's right even when adults tell you you're wrong. Grace and Eleanor knew that the story belonged to everyone now, that it had taken on a life beyond their own experiences, and they were okay with that, understood that stories grow and change as they're passed down, that the specific details matter less than the emotional truth at the core. But they also kept the real story alive between them, the complicated, messy, fully human version that didn't fit neatly into any moral or message, the version where they were just two scared little girls trying to navigate a world that seemed determined to keep them apart, and where love and courage had been enough to bridge the gap. On the 50th anniversary of the day Grace had removed the bead from Eleanor's ear, they held a joint press conference, announcing a new scholarship fund for underprivileged children pursuing medical education, named in honor of Grace's mother, who had passed away the year before, having lived to see her daughter become everything she'd hoped and more. "My mother taught me two things," Grace said at the press conference, her voice steady despite her grief. "She taught me that hard work matters, that dignity isn't dependent on how much money you make, or what job you do. And she taught me that love is action, not just feeling. She loved me by working impossible hours to keep food on our table. She loved me by teaching me to be kind even when the world was unkind to us. She loved me by being brave enough to bring me to work with her that day, even though she was afraid of losing her job, because she had no one else to watch me. Everything I am, everything I've accomplished comes back to her." Eleanor spoke next, and she talked about how Grace's mother had become like a second mother to her, had shown her what maternal love looked like when it wasn't conditional or performative, had given her a model for the kind of parent she wanted to be. "She saw me when my own family couldn't see past their expectations and disappointments," Eleanor said. "She treated me with gentleness and respect when others treated me like a burden or a problem. And she raised a daughter who had the courage to save my life." This scholarship is our way of honoring her legacy, of making sure that other children from backgrounds like Grace's get the same opportunities, the same chance to become everything they're capable of becoming. The scholarship fund grew quickly, supported by donations from people who had been moved by their story, and within a few years it was helping hundreds of students pursue medical careers, and some of those students would go on to become doctors who listened carefully, who trusted their observations, who saw patients as people, and the ripples continued to spread. Grace published a memoir when she was 65 titled The Bead, A Story of Sight and Sound, and it became a bestseller, resonating with readers who saw their own experiences reflected in her story, people who had been dismissed or overlooked, people who had found the courage to trust themselves, people who had been saved by someone else's kindness. Eleanor wrote the foreword, and in it, she talked about what it meant to be truly seen by another person, to have someone look at you and recognize your humanity, even when the world has decided you don't matter. "Grace saw me when I was invisible," Eleanor wrote. "She saw my pain when everyone else had looked away. She saw a solution when experts had declared the problem unsolvable. But more than that, she saw me as a person worth saving, worth risking everything for. And in doing so, she taught me to see myself that way too. She taught me that I wasn't broken, that I wasn't the problem, that I was worthy of love and respect, and a life filled with sound and color and connection. Everything good in my life flows from that moment when she decided I mattered enough to be brave for." The book sparked a renewed interest in their story, and a new generation discovered what had happened, and young people began using their story as a rallying cry for social justice, for challenging authority, for believing in themselves, and Grace and Eleanor watched with some bemusement as they became symbols for movements and causes they'd never intended to represent. But they also understood that this was how stories worked, that once you shared your truth with the world, it stopped being yours alone and became part of the collective consciousness, interpreted and reinterpreted, used and misused, but ultimately meaningful to the people who needed it to mean something. They made peace with their fame, such as it was, and they used their platforms to advocate for the causes they cared about, and they continued to live their lives, continued to work and love and raise their families, and the story of what had happened when they were 7 became just one part of their larger stories, important but not definitional, foundational but not limiting. In their 70s they took a trip together, just the two of them, to a quiet beach town where no one recognized them and where they could simply be two old friends, walking on the sand and watching the sunset and talking about everything and nothing. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd been wrong?" Grace asked one evening as they sat on the porch of their rental house, watching the waves. "If there hadn't been anything in your ear? If I'd been imagining things?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "I think you would have apologized and I would have forgiven you, and we would have figured something else out. Because the point wasn't whether you were right about the specific solution. The point was that you cared enough to try. That you saw me suffering and refused to accept that there was nothing that could be done. Even if you'd been wrong about the bead, you would have been right about the most important thing. That I deserved someone to fight for me." Grace nodded, satisfied with that answer, and they sat in comfortable silence, two women who had known each other for 7 decades, who had seen each other through every significant moment of their lives, who had become family in the deepest sense of the word. "Thank you," Grace said finally, and Eleanor turned to her, confused. "For what?" "For trusting me," Grace said. "For tilting your head that day and letting me try. You were 7 years old, and you trusted a girl you barely knew to do something that could have hurt you. That was brave. That was so brave." Eleanor smiled and reached for Grace's hand. "We were both brave. We saved each other. And we've been saving each other ever since." They watched the sunset together, and Grace thought about the journey they'd been on, from that moment in the billionaire's mansion to this moment on a quiet beach, and she thought about all the lives they'd touched, all the children they'd helped, all the ripples that had spread from one act of courage. And she thought about her mother, who had taught her to be strong and kind, who had shown her through example what it meant to maintain dignity in the face of disrespect, who had given her the foundation she'd needed to be brave when it mattered. And Eleanor thought about the silence she'd lived in for 7 years, and how that silence had taught her to be observant, to read faces and body language, to understand that communication happens in many forms, and how those skills had made her better at her work, more empathetic, more attuned to the unspoken needs of the children she served. They thought about the grandmother, about the damage she'd caused and the lessons her cruelty had taught them, about how understanding someone's motivations doesn't require excusing their actions, about how forgiveness is a process, not a destination. They thought about Mr. Whitmore, about how he tried to make amends, about how some mistakes can't be fully repaired but the effort to repair them still matters, about how people can change if they're willing to do the hard work of examining themselves honestly. They thought about all the people who had doubted them, who had dismissed Grace because of her age and race and economic status, who had given up on Eleanor because she was deaf, and they thought about how wrong those people had been, how limiting their assumptions had been. And they thought about the future, about their children and grandchildren, about the world those young people would inherit, and they hoped that it would be a world where every child was seen, every voice was heard, every person was valued regardless of their circumstances or their background. The sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, and Grace and Eleanor sat together in the gathering darkness, and they didn't need to speak because they understood each other in ways that went beyond words, beyond sound, beyond all the surface differences that the world insisted mattered. They were two souls who had found each other in unlikely circumstances, who had saved each other in profound ways, who had built lives dedicated to extending that same grace to others, and their friendship was a testament to what was possible when people chose to see each other's humanity, when they chose courage over comfort, when they chose love over fear. And in that moment, sitting on that porch watching that sunset, they were exactly where they needed to be, exactly who they needed to be, their lives a living answer to the question of whether one person can make a difference, whether one act of courage can change the world. The answer they both knew was yes. Again and again and always yes. because in the end it wasn't the money or the power or the privilege that mattered. It was the flashlight held steady in a small hand, the tweezers moving carefully millimeter by millimeter, the trust of one child and the courage of another, the refusal to accept that suffering was inevitable, or that truth was unknowable, the belief that every person deserved to be seen, to be heard, to be saved. And that belief, acted upon, had been enough to change everything.